All right, hi everyone. Glad that you join us today for this webinar on the upcoming Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council. My name is Matthew Landrio. I am the director of the Observatoire on Politics and Security in the Arctic, OPSA. I want to welcome you to this conference. I think we have 5 fantastic scholars here to talk about the upcoming chairmanship. This conference, of course, it's not just OPSA that organized it. It is co-organized with the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, NAADSN, and of course, the Center for International Policy Studies of the University of Ottawa. Before we start this conference, as we are physically based, and I'm just going to wait a bit, as we are physically based in the Ottawa-Gatineau region, CIPS and OPSA as well. I want to highlight that we pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa their own. We also want to acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Today, we convene 5 great scholars to talk about the upcoming Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council. I think the chairmanship is an interesting event that compels us to look at a few different things. First, it allows you to look at the evolution of the Arctic Council. We're sure going to talk about, we're going to refer to the evolution of the council. It also allows us to assess and kind of try to predict the trajectory of Russia's Arctic policy, which is of course a focal point for many Arctic scholars and decision makers. By doing that, of course, we want to also focus on and analyze the impacts that this chairmanship will have or is likely to have on other Arctic states, including Nordic countries, including Canada. As for structure today, each panelist that you saw in the description of the event will present their opinions for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open up the floor, the virtual floor, for a Q&A. As long as we talk about this Q&A, at any point in time during this conference, if you have a question for a panelist, you can submit it at the bottom of the screen in the Q&A section. We have access to your questions, so we'll go through the questions as they arrived. So, without further ado, I want to turn to our first panelist, Kozia Smisek. And she studied, Dr. Smisek studied different Arctic Council's chairmanship, and their accomplishments since 1996. So I thought it would be kind of a good introduction on this team to hear your insights about put what an Arctic Council chairmanship in context, what it's about, what an incoming chairmanship could also accomplish, and what a new chairmanship can bring to the Arctic table. It's a 2-year, but what they can bring to the table. So without further ado, I want to turn the attention to Kozia Smisek.
Great, thank you very much, Matthew. Perhaps the first technical check, if you can hear me well, and I hope this all works. So let me just share my screen. Great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for putting together this really exciting panel and the discussions. And as Matthew mentioned, in part of my work, I was studying chairmanships of the Arctic Council. So I guess maybe this presentation is a little bit of introduction to all following presentations that we'll hear from other speakers. And I think when we are speaking about the role of the chairmanship in the Arctic Council, it is really interesting to and important to go back to history and to really look at the roots of the Arctic Council, where in negotiations toward Ottawa Declaration in 1996, it was actually upon the insistence of United States that it was very clear the chairmanship of, or at the time, host country of the Arctic Council was meant to be primarily administrative arrangement, really void of any leadership functions. So the point was really to split the costs of running the council between all the Arctic states, so that each one of them would be hosting meetings of the council in a rotating manner, and throughout 2-year period to provide secretarial functions to the council. In fact, when we look back at documents from the negotiations, we see that the role of the chairmanship was actually designed mostly to, and was meant to be confined almost only to ministerial meetings of the Arctic Council, not really even to the entire 2-year period. But of course, that as the entire Arctic Council, as the entire Arctic situation, also this arrangement has quite significantly evolved throughout now 25 years of the Council. And as all other elements of the Council, this evolution has happened pretty much within the same rules of procedure that were set up for the Council in 1998. Of course, we had those rules revised in 2013, but really not that much has changed. One major change that took place, and of course, many persons on this call in the audience are very well aware of this one, was the establishment of the Arctic Council in 2014. So since then, it is the Secretariat that provides support functions to the Arctic Council chairmanship. And actually, when we look at the terms of reference of the Secretariat is really envisioned as the support to the Arctic Council, but primarily to the chairmanship and to the chair of senior Arctic officials. Two other things worth mentioning here about the role, about the chairmanship of the Council was also, of course, that as Arctic issues has been rising in prominence on agendas of all Arctic states, we have clearly seen how ministries of foreign affairs of Arctic nations have been playing increasingly active role, of course, leading to this, that today's ministerial meetings of the Arctic Council are attended by ministers of foreign affairs of all Arctic states, something that was really not the case many years back in the past. Last thing to say, so will be the case of Russia, but so is the practice that the chairmanship in the Arctic Council chairs not only, well, the group of senior Arctic officials, but it simultaneously takes over also chairmanship of the Sustainable Development Working Group, since few years also expert group on black carbon and methane, and Arctic Economic Council, which of course is not the subsidiary body of the Arctic Council, but it has been created from its initiatives during or after second Canadian chairmanship. And I will come back to the Arctic Economic Council in a moment. So when it comes to functions of the chair, and that's perhaps just a brief overview here, but three basic functions of the chair in the Arctic Council, but also in many other international bodies. The first one is really of agenda setting. So this is something that is in the hands of the chair of the Arctic Council, of the chair of senior Arctic officials, as much as is also brokerage. So basically, the question of consolidating, negotiating, discussing positions between different Arctic states and permanent participants, finding areas of common interest is really one of the most important areas where the chair plays a critical role. The third issue here is also representation. And as you can see in this slide, I think we can talk about representation of the Arctic Council vis-a-vis external bodies, but also toward observers to the Arctic Council. And why there is a certain distinction between those two, it is basically rooted in this in the consensus-based decision-making nature of the Council, which I think it is extremely important to remember about it in all our discussions about chairmanships, because especially when it comes to representing Council vis-a-vis any other organizations, it is basically something that needs to be approved by all Arctic states before chair would take on such a mission to discuss anything externally. The situation looks slightly different with the observers to the Arctic Council, but of course, as questions of participation, of involvement of non-Arctic states and organization is of steadily increasing importance, this contact facilitating, maintaining relations with increasing number of observers is also something that chair of the Arctic Council holds squarely in its hands for 2 years. And finally, there is of course the practice of suggesting priorities for 2-year rotating term. It is not something that is included in the rules of procedure of the Council. It is a customary practice, but what we have increasingly seen over the last decades is how chairmanship use their 2-year term at the helm of the Council to promote and highlight their particular Arctic interests and areas of expertise. So since, well, the discussions as we have talked with Matthew before was to look also, well, between continuity and change. Here you can just see chairmanship teams of four last chairmanships of the Arctic Council, and I use those four because this is basically the period in 2013 when the chairmanship went back to Canada, and we began second period of consecutive chairmanships of the Council. So as you can see, we have teams like One Arctic, exploring common solutions, Together towards Sustainable Arctic, etc. But in fact, even though countries through their priorities play in some sense a leadership role in setting objectives or directions for the Council 2-year periods, actually when we look at the priorities that countries have been setting, all of them could be basically categorized into 4 groups, and one of them will be always peoples of the Arctic, under the title of Arctic communities, Arctic peoples, however one wishes. The second thing always present there is environmental protection and climate change. That's always repeating element, and you can see all of them here in this slide. Of course, framed differently, but pretty much the essence remains the same. 2 other issues that, next to climate change, environment, and Arctic peoples, repeat most often, of course, relate to oceans and to strengthening of the Arctic Council. Not every single chairmanship had it among its priorities, but many of them consistently do. And this is basically what we will see with Russian chairmanship priorities. And I know that Troy will go in depth into those, so I'm just listing here them to show that pretty much also Russian Federation coming to chair the Council defined its priorities pretty much along the same lines. One thing worth noting here, of course, that depending on the country taking the lead, we see greater or lesser stress on economic growth, on economic development, and on the use of natural resources. In case of Russia, those elements have been very much emphasized. In addition, Russia has also expressed support for continuation of the senior Arctic officials-based marine mechanism, so-called SMM, that has started during Iceland's chairmanship, and also closer work with the Arctic Economic Council. I think what is interesting here, it will be very interesting discussion, and I think to see how this will go forward with respect to Economic Council, because of course one thing that needs to be remembered that whenever it comes to matters of funding, financing, or even business, of course, the closer it gets to the core, the closer it gets also to sanctions between Western countries and Russia. Nonetheless, the official program of the chairmanship has not been announced yet. It will be officially announced and confirmed at the ministerial meeting coming in a few weeks. That said, even though we are looking at priorities of the council, of course, it is very important to underline that that any chair of the Arctic Council does not have capacity to unilaterally dictate the Arctic Council focus. And of course, as many persons surely are very well aware of, the project of most of the Arctic Council working groups, they actually do span way beyond a single chairmanship, and their work continues largely uninterrupted. So for instance, and I just used here examples of two, but at this point of time, for instance, AMAP, their climate updates, the reports on the state of climate change in the Arctic, they are produced every second year. Similarly, CAF, for instance, its implementation plan for biodiversity action, it is designed to span several chairmanships. So all this work that often, or that much, how would I say, that less often catches attention of media, this is actually where work of the Arctic Council continues largely in an uninterrupted fashion. So what modes of work actually do chairmanship have to advance their priorities and to highlight issues that they would like to see in the spotlight? One thing that we have seen is actually the increasing use of additional events, and they might be taking place both within and outside of the Arctic Council. And this is also what we might be seeing, especially during Russia chairmanship, which has already announced quite a few of those events coming up in the next 2 years. And before I come to an end, I wanted to draw attention to one issue that I think makes the role of the chairmanship in one way increasingly important. And it is actually the question of increasingly politicized, but also volatile international environment. Because basically one of the things that we have seen throughout the second round of consecutive chairmanships of the Arctic Council is that every Arctic state at the helm of the Council was forced to deal with external developments in order to continue to preserve work of the Council. So for instance, when we look at Canada in 2013, 2015, of course, Canada was actually in a very, well, unpredictable manner, but it was forced to deal with response to Russia following annexation of Crimea in 2014. Of course, that was one of the major crises that actually the Council needed to respond to, and as we all know, it has been done successfully. But so, for instance, during United States chairmanship, in fact, what United States went through was the domestic change of its own administration to, of course, to Trump administration, which greatly shifted all the priorities in the Council. Finland, in fact, well, even though there were no major crises, of course, it was actually in hands of Finland to cope with much altered US position. And as we know, the hard position of, well, denial of United States and refusal to include climate change ultimately led to lack of declaration from Rovaniemi ministerial meeting. And lastly, of course, on the watch of Iceland, not only Iceland had to respond extremely creatively to conditions and constraints of COVID-19 pandemic, but it is also a very interesting example how the responsibility of the chair is not only to respond to crisis, but there are also situations where there is actually a question of grasping the windows of opportunity to advance Arctic Council work. And I'm mentioning here Iceland specifically because once more the change of the US administration and the incoming Biden administration January this year, all of a sudden opened the possibility for Iceland to restart the work on the Arctic Council strategic plan. So if everything goes as planned, of course, the results are still to be awaited, but there are really high chances that that at the ministerial meeting in Reykjavik, we'll be looking at the first ever strategic plan of the Arctic Council. Once more, it is the chairmanship in this case can be really credited for their very proactive role and bringing everyone together and using this opportunity that opened to them. So with that, I would like to come to my last point, that perhaps that might be actually one of the principal roles of the chairmanship. So of course, there is the question of priorities that countries set for themselves, but more than everything else, it is really for the chair of the Arctic Council to ensure smooth and successful functioning of the AC during every 2-year period. So that includes formulating issues in the fashion that would be agreeable to all parties, and that might be arguably not necessarily increasingly difficult, but definitely more time-consuming as political stakes are all the time rising in the region. Equally important is also a question of steering away from tensions and from matters that could become impediments to cooperation in the Arctic Council. Because one thing that is really vital to the chairmanship and to functioning of the Arctic Council is finding common ground between all Arctic states and permanent participants. So with that, I think it is interesting to think about that that chairmanship, on the one hand, presents a great opportunity for the Council to highlight its Arctic work, but in a sense, it might be also an interesting constraint as to what extent the Council, or excuse me, the chairmanship can really advance its own agenda, given that it needs to ensure the success of the Council as a whole. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Smithek. Very interesting ideas. We're probably going to talk again about in discussion afterwards about continuity and the Council being consensus-based. Thank you for these points. It provides us also kind of a good introduction context to what a chairmanship can and cannot do, right, in the Arctic context. On this note, I'll turn the screen to Troy Bouffard. She's the director of the Center for Arctic Security and Resilience at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Of course, Professor Bouffard has studied some of the early announcements, some of the early signs, right, of what we can expect from the Russian chairmanship coming forward. So, without further ado, Troy.
Thanks, sir. Let me share the screen real quick. Okay. So hello, everyone, and thank you for having me for this event, especially important and timely as the chairmanship turnover is about to occur here in about 3 weeks. Caveat a couple of things here real quick. A lot of this work is ongoing. As Matthew just said, we've been doing this for quite a while. I'm director of the Center for Arctic Security and Resilience here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And ever since this year, about January, not sure if it's tied to the administration, but for the United States, the Arctic has become a much more accelerated topic. a little bit of my background Arctic-wise. I retired from the U.S. military and continue to work with the Department of Defense, U.S. NORTHCOM, Alaskan Command, done work with NATO also on Arctic projects and issues, and continuing some work right now also with the State Department and the Arctic Council as a delegate to the EPPR working group. I don't speak on behalf of any of those organizations, but I've had experience with the Arctic Council in the past on working groups, as Goja mentioned, the SDWG working group and projects, as well as senior Arctic official meetings as a delegate also. And the work continues, and it's been extremely rewarding. So come at you with a modest experience and then scholarship, continuing to study. This has been a very exciting time. Sometimes, I feel a little bit bad for Iceland, who precedes the Russian chairmanship, and everyone just wants to talk about Russia, but Iceland's done a phenomenal job, especially through COVID. It is so difficult to hold these meetings and get work done for the Arctic Council. They're very important work, and they certainly demonstrated an incredible ability to facilitate very important work and help to manage the work and transition to Russia. So let's moving on. A little bit of an introduction. So there's a lot going on here that Russia has been very focused on when in preparation for its chairmanship. The chairmanship is not just a leadership position for 2 years. It also provides an incredible opportunity for that Arctic state to demonstrate its Arcticness, right? And there's no other opportunity like it. Right? It's very important in that regard. And with that, as Goja mentioned, the chair has a limited amount of what it can do. The Arctic Council speaks in one voice. Everything that goes out into the public is done based on a consensus, and it speaks with one voice, right? So even the agenda, one of the more important aspects of influence, perhaps about a chairmanship, is the ability to control the agenda. But even in the Arctic Council, everything on the agenda has to be agreed on by all member states. So that's a bit limited, but Russia, the very interesting presentation is, how is Russia going to use this chairmanship? Although we know what the Arctic Council is and is not, what it can accomplish, there's quite a bit it can accomplish associated with the Arctic Council. So we'll go over that, and hopefully that provides a little bit more awareness for what to expect these next 2 years under the Russian Arctic Council chairmanship. It's going to be an incredible show. So part of what Russia's been doing to prepare for its chairmanship and to leverage and take advantage of these very important 2 years. 2 years, which often takes more time to prepare for than actually conduct, involved a lot of strategic and policy development published, some very recently, including the implementation plan for the Arctic Development Strategy. Right, that was something Putin ordered in March based on the October strategy. And this has helped us to focus on how important and serious development of the Arctic is for Russia. We've noticed a couple of things that might be interesting to you all. So all these plans are in place. When, just of note, when Russia is speaking about the Arctic zone, this is the territory, about everything above the green borderline there. All right, so with that comes everything in the strategy, the focus areas, special taxation, social programs, support. And as you'll notice, the latest implementation plan of the development strategy really spoke to some serious issues that Russia is facing, kind of a lack of population exodus a little bit from the north, which is vital to realizing some of the goals of the Arctic. So this new implementation plan really spoke to that in very pragmatic ways, right? Instead of the Cold War, forced population, forced peoples into the north, they're just building basic incentives. The plan talks about making the north a more comfortable place to live in general. Put up the basic infrastructure, medical coverage, roads, just things that are basic human needs that will provide incentive to actually live up there and help realize the development goals of Russia. So this is the zone they're talking about. And when they're talking about the Northern Sea route, it's a separate route, but just FYI. Something to think about also with Russian policy deficiencies, we would think that normally during an authoritarian regime, Putin could just sit back and dictate what he wants to happen in the north, and it's going to happen. And that's sort of normal. How you kind of expect it is different from the democratic process, which is very messy because there's lots of inclusion. It takes a lot of time versus authoritarian. And it's just not the case when it comes to the development of the Russia. We've
It appears that Troy got disconnected due to bad connection, unfortunately.
Oh, so we ran into some technical difficulties. Troy, are you there? Could you continue?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm not sure where I was, but let me share screen again.
It literally cut out 30 seconds ago. So less than a minute.
So talking.
And we'll just get you to reshare your screen as well. Now we're noticing you have a very bad connection at the moment. So one thing that I do suggest is that you close your camera and we simply have your voice follow your presentation.
How's it?
Should be okay, yeah. Let's try that.
All righty, sorry about that, everyone. So I was leading up a little bit about Russian policy efficiencies, just talking about the differences between democratic authoritarian regimes and an ability to achieve goals, right? And you'd expect in Russia that authoritarian regimes can kind of just dictate and force policies, and sometimes that's largely the case. But when it comes to the Arctic development, that's not been the case. Let's look at how. Also, in preparation for the upcoming chairmanship, Russia has made sure to put in place the key members of the government in order to ensure that he has everything set up from his key spokespersons and representatives, which he's done, right? There was a lot of shuffling in November. People got fired, people got hired, right? Trusted advisors are in place to help represent the Arctic interests of Russia, to include Yuri Trutnev. He's one of the leads and probably the most influential person to Putin directly when it comes to advising. So when I talked a little bit about the development strategy, this is kind of occurring in a way that we wouldn't expect from Russia, and it's in direct alignment and synchronized with the upcoming chairmanship. The development is so important, and Russia realizes that you can't just dictate terms in the Arctic. Right? I think everybody understands how that works. There's so many unknowns, so much uncertainty that it needs to be done effectively with lots of inclusion, or risk for failure is much higher. So there's an official state commission that oversees much of the development interests and requirements, as well as an expert group of about 207 people. And these groups are very active in helping to take the policy recommendations, help develop the policies, and help implement and come up with the best ways to do this. This is very much what we would expect in the West. Lots of inclusion and lots of concern for doing things effectively in a place with so much uncertainty. We're seeing this with definitely with Russia. Just to kind of close off and hand things off to Dr. Lockenbauer to kind of continue with some of our own research, and he can share a link, I think, to our previous published article. What we can expect for the council chairmanship is a packed agenda, right? And to the extent that a lot is released to the public, we've already heard a little bit, Russia bragging about 89 some odd official events. And this is really one of the key takeaways for this. When it comes to how the chair of the Arctic Council schedules events, the Arctic Council proper, right, the official business of the Arctic Council is constrained to the requirements of how that forum functions. So the ability of Russia or any state that's hosting or chairing the Arctic Council is pretty limited, right? It will go on as normal, like we've seen every nation and its Arctic Council events as it's chaired and hosted. But what becomes very important in conjunction with the Arctic Council chairmanship is hosting not only Arctic Council proper events, but the ability to stack stuff before, during, and after all around the Arctic Council proper events, official events, with all kinds of extra stuff, ancillary events. It's expected Arctic Council members often go out in public and speak about the Arctic Council or projects. And this is the area where the host, the chair, can magnify the effect of the Arctic Council chairmanship. And I expect hundreds of co-located, co-timed events around just about every Arctic Council event you can imagine. Like Goja said, the chair takes over the SAO events. Those will be in Russia, and they also will chair and host all of the SDWG. Anything else, we'll see how that works out. But that co-location, co-timed is where you get a captive audience. Everyone in the Arctic Council is present, and they're coming into the city. It draws a lot of attention, people, and media. You can take advantage of this in ways you can probably imagine, right? And this allows for very deliberate opportunities to message, synchronize, align. And what we're going to see basically for the next 2 years is the greatest Arctic show we've ever seen in the interest of what Dr. Lockenbauer is going to talk about next. There is a purpose to this. So here's a little bit of insight into what to expect, and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Troy. Sorry about some of the technical difficulties, but a good overview of what we can expect from the chairmanship with events and initiatives. And it seems that people in charge also were changed recently, so there seems to be rotation also as to how to put in place these priorities. For sure. Thank you, Troy, for this presentation. I'll turn it now, as Prabhu mentioned, to Whitney Lackenbauer, which is the Canada Research Chair, the study of the Canadian North, also the lead of one of the organizers co-organizing this, the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, NAADSN. And Dr. Lackenbauer will present a bit. What are the implications? What are some of the dilemmas? What are some of the debates that an Arctic state like Canada will be confronted to during the next 2 years? Whitney?
Great. Well, thanks, Mathieu, and thanks to all the other organizers as well. I know you're the lead on this, but to all of your team, and very much a privilege and an honor to be on such a distinguished panel and have such a wonderful roster of audience members who I very much look forward to hearing questions from, and perhaps also some insights from. First, I want to begin by stating I've been on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory that's covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and by taking the time to acknowledge the land that I sit on, I remind myself of the long history of silencing in our country and the need to speak the truth on a journey towards reconciliation. Today, I'm going to offer some reflections, as Mathieu alluded to, on the so what for Canada. And in some respects, what I'm going to cover in my comments are not necessarily going to be the most important elements of the Arctic Council chairmanship or chairship vis-a-vis Canada, but just a few elements that I think are kind of interesting amidst the other voices on this particular panel. So first of all, Canadian audiences will be familiar with the Canadian Arctic Policy Framework, but it's important to nest Canada's expectations and also our posture towards the chairship and the Arctic Council more generally within this very comprehensive strategic approach that we're still continuing to co-develop and hopefully will begin to co-implement with a whole range of different Canadian rights holders and stakeholder partners. And when we look across the Arctic Northern Policy Framework wheel, this aligns very closely with the different messages that Canada has carried to the Arctic Council, even before the Arctic Council was stood up by the Ottawa Declaration in 1996. And in many respects, Canada's approach to the Council, I would argue, has always been projecting a lot of our domestic interests and our domestic visions into the circumpolar world. And I say that because it shouldn't alarm us nor necessarily surprise us that other chairs do the same thing. Sometimes that might not be exact alignment with our view of the world, but for the most part, it's a practice that Goji has touched on and Troy has also touched on as well. That's something that we should expect. So again, when we look at Canada's mission, what we're seeking to achieve, strong, self-reliant people and communities working together for a vibrant, prosperous, sustainable Arctic at home and abroad, while expressing our enduring Arctic sovereignty. So I put that up because if Russia is using the language of strong communities, sustainable Arctic development, and also as a subtext, enhancing or asserting or protecting its own Arctic sovereignty, those are not things that are surprising coming from an Arctic state. When we look at the Arctic Northern Policy Framework International chapter that Canada produced in 2019, it's interesting here that it's a message that affirms that, yes, in other areas of the Arctic Northern Policy Framework, there's an emphasis on some of the tensions that we don't see eye to eye with Russia on certain international developments, and that great power competition is resurgent. Yet it does commit Canada to take steps to restart a regular bilateral dialogue on Arctic issues with Russia, and then identifies a list of key areas: Indigenous issues, scientific cooperation, environmental protection, shipping, search and rescue. I flag all of these areas are articulated by Anton Vasilyev, former Russian senior Arctic official, 2008-2014, in his statement to the Arctic Circle about priorities of the Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council 2021 to 2023. He could have literally cut and paste what Canada said it would like to work with Russia on, and then he articulated that to the world as priorities. And this is suggesting that we have common interests, priorities, challenges, not only at the national level, but also more deep at the community level, as people struggle to adapt and thrive in rapidly changing conditions, and then refers to the environment. So I set this up because there is space within overarching Canadian policy to suggest and positively with the Russians in areas of common interest. And these areas of interest overlap quite well with what Russia is articulating as being its priorities as Arctic Council chair. Now, Professor Buffard referenced the long-titled executive order that came out last fall, penned and signed by, or not penned, but signed by Vladimir Putin. And it's interesting because it was framed as if it was a national security document and a product as part of Russia's national security articulation. But when you actually read the document, it goes far beyond that. What in international relations terms we call it's much broader than simply military security or conventional national security. Covers a whole range of environmental issues, developmental issues, in-depth articulation of some of the health concerns, differential socioeconomic indicators in the Russian north compared to other parts of the Federation. Yes, it definitely talks, and I would say a relatively modest section that does not in any way dominate the strategy, talks about some military interests, but then it emphasizes international cooperation. And what you see here on the slide are just a couple of excerpts talking about a multi-vector foreign policy. And we'll get back to that later, but Russia does speak with multiple messages, as do most of the Arctic states when it comes to circumpolar affairs, but talks about preserving the Arctic as territorially beneficial cooperation, right? That old dream of Mikhail Gorbachev back in '87, flowing right through to present. Ensuring mutually beneficial bilateral and multilateral cooperation, adherence to an international rules-based order, laws, no funny business over extended continental shelves, for example. Russia is going to be compliant, they tell us. And then ensuring the effective operation of the Council under the Russian chairmanship, including promoting joint projects aimed at ensuring sustainable development and preserving the cultural heritage of Indigenous people. In the overall strategy, it's about sustainable development and Indigenous peoples that are highlighted front and center. So as we've seen our first indications of what the chair is actually going to encompass from 2021 to 2023, we see an affirmation of a lot of these messages and a clear articulation by Russia that their plan is to ensure achieving Russia's strategic goals on economic and social development more broadly. So using the Arctic Council as a portal to message out Russia's desired intent for its region, and at the same time, enhance the country's global image. These are coming from Russian sources. And it intends to do so through a general plan focusing on environmental, social, and economic problems, eliminating consequences of environmental accidents, right? We can look to Norilsk and other reasons why that's top of mind for many Russians, reducing emissions, increasing awareness, facilitating adaptation to climate change, a lot of focus on quality of life for peoples of the Russian North, and then this desire to make the Arctic really attractive for investors, and a series of indicators of where Russia may take that in the coming 2 years. So Gosha's already done a really superb job of laying this out, but when I look at comparative chairmanship or chairship agendas between Canada's second chair and Russia's imminent second chair, I don't see a lot of difference. And like others, I see a lot more continuity and I see change, the general tenor of where this is going. But certainly in Russia's case, we do see sustainable development, which some other linguists have done a much better job of explaining how in the Russian language that sometimes means something different than it's used conventionally in Western circles in English. But that is an overarching concept that is driving it, but a lot of focus as well on resource development, non-renewable resource development, and the Northern Sea Route, make no mistake about it. Others have already referred to the vigorous tempo of activity that we should expect over the next 2 years. Certain Russian statements have indicated this, at least 90 events. They're expecting more than 12,000 people to take part in these events alone. And in explaining what these events will cover, it's interesting that this clearly goes beyond what is the narrow mandate of, or I guess it's not a narrow mandate, but what Russia's avowed and explicit Arctic Council chair priorities are going to be, and a broader suite of issues that are very much at the top of mind for Russian strategic priorities regarding the Northern Sea Route, certain technologies that will enable development in a more feasible manner than we have at present, issues of navigation and so on, as well as healthcare, socioeconomic and cultural issues. So all things that we can expect to see going on around the margins or in concurrent events to the official Arctic Council activities. So as a pivot to Canada, what do I see as the main constraint? Well, for Canada, it's the fact that we face a dominant narrative now in our news media that depicts Russia as an Arctic threat. And this is partly driven by very clearly identifying Russia and China as the two main threats to Arctic stability. This is becoming, I think, a more binary narrative in Canadian news circles at this point in time. And this, I think, does set up conditions that are going to challenge Canadians from being able to see and respect what Russia has in terms of rights as a large Arctic state, as a sovereign Arctic state, and with a state with its own interests and values that, as we talked about before, have some common ground with Canada, but are not always entirely aligned. But that doesn't mean that they can be dismissed out of hand. So what does this mean for us? A colleague of mine, Sigrid Sukonkin, has warned that Canada might be a prime target. And what I'm going to focus on for the last few minutes that I have here is a particular aspect of where Canada might be susceptible to messaging that's not favorable to our interests. We face a situation, he says, where the Kremlin is seeking to dominate the Arctic, and make no mistake, Russia's in competition with Canada. We can anticipate escalations in information warfare, whether it's cyber attacks, information wars, Russia seeking to overwhelm Canadians with disinformation or targeted specific misinformation that will throw us off, polarize Canadians, and undermine our democratic processes. He's suggesting we should be expecting this. So this falls within a broader Russian disinformation and propaganda ecosystem that you can read a little bit more about in some of the stuff that Troy Bouffard and I have written. But it's important to emphasize this is taking place in multiple media platforms. There's no pretense or desire for unified messaging across sources because different audiences might be susceptible to, or open to different kinds of messaging. So there's a whole series of varied overlapping approaches that are perceived to be mutually reinforcing, even when individual messages appear to be contradictory. And this allows for variation in false or skewed narratives to fit target audiences. There's no need for consistency as there is with official government policy documents or statements. And what this ecosystem facilitates is the circulation of disinformation that's prejudicial to adversaries while allowing the Russian state to disavow responsibility for malign activity. And then you can have a multiplier effect as stories interact and offer circular validation. And all of this sows confusion as audiences try to parse truth from fabrication or distortion. Now, I don't want to say this is rampant in the Arctic and certainly not in the Canadian Arctic at this stage, but we see this playing out in other parts of the world. We might also look to foreign and domestic discourses on the Russian Arctic and how within Russia itself, there are clearly different messages that are projected internationally and those being offered to Russians themselves internal to Russia. I would suggest this should not surprise us at all. I think the same thing can be said about Canada, particularly when you extend out of official discourse and go into academic realms or some of the think tank commentaries that are out there. But it's very telling to suggest that, make no mistake, there are multiple streams and multiple prongs to messaging in Russia as elsewhere. So I've spent a lot of my time focusing on state-funded foreign-facing media. So this is information that's being promoted by mainstream outlets in quite traditional formats. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but suffice to say, looking at these messages allows us to anticipate how Arctic-related pro-Russian and anti-Russian narratives are in play, and arguably will continue to be in play on the margins of the Arctic Council chair. And that this shouldn't surprise us, and it doesn't negate Russia's legitimacy as Arctic Council chair. Of course, it has its turn to be there and should be there. Nor does it inherently invalidate those chair priorities. But it does suggest that we need to be attuned to some of the other messaging that's going on around all of this. So pro-Russian messaging, I think the first point here is the one I want to stress in this context, that Russia sees itself as the most legitimate Arctic actor. It can mobilize numbers, everything from population to sheer frontage on the Arctic Ocean, to land mass, to economics, to suggest that it is the primary driver in the Arctic caravan. So a lot of the messaging, of course, is trying to suggest that Russia has legitimacy, and this is coupled by messaging that seeks to delegitimize a lot of the Western narratives in circulation. So whereas Western narratives often talk about Russia as seeking to be a revisionist actor or having designs on territorial conquest along the lines of what it did in Crimea, for example, Russian messaging emphasizes NATO desires to push Russia out of the Arctic and deny Russia's legitimate right to exploit its resources. So this is a pretext for Russia to invest in what it calls defensive military capabilities, dual-use capabilities, by suggesting that it's the West that's actually the aggressor. And this plays out alongside the narratives talking about the ongoing peace and stability of the Arctic as a region, where Russia and Western states continue to work together towards a peaceful end state. A lot of the targeting of this messaging focuses on the United States, which is not surprising, but also tries to downplay the ability of the West to have the strength to actually stand up to Russia, particularly when talking about Russian audiences. So a couple of areas to cut to the chase where I think there will be interesting issues arising over the next 2 years. One relates to China, the Russian ambassador, Korchinov, suggesting that Russia will welcome more active engagement of the observer states. This is interesting to read into what that's going to mean. Moscow's dominant official messaging is that China is an ally and an economic political partner. But Russian media often uses Western voices to raise concerns about Chinese influence, Chinese investment, and what that means for Russia. So it's an indirect way that Western voices are mobilized to offer critiques that Russians don't officially want to make themselves for fear that it will turn off the Chinese. So I'm not sure whether to anticipate that Russia is going to try to position itself as chair to be the champion of certain observer states, read China, at the Arctic Council, and how it's going to manage that alongside vigorously defending Arctic state sovereignty in other contexts, which is prone to do. Another area of interest is Indigenous peoples. This is a Russian chair priority. And certainly the Arctic 2035 strategy that I spoke about before promises the active participation of Russian state and nonprofit organizations in the work of the Council and other international forums. There's also talk about ensuring that Northern youth, for example, are involved in a lot of these discussions. Yet we've also observed what the Russian state has done when groups like the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North didn't have leadership or were not articulating messages consistent with that of the Kremlin in 2012, right? A replacement of the leadership. Recent claims against the Center for the Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North, the CIPS, which has had legal actions brought against it, trying to serve as an advocacy organization for Russian small peoples in the North, being clamped down. So at the same time, we also have Russian media actively emphasizing how Canada and the US are guilty of genocide against Arctic Indigenous peoples. Not a surprising word, given that our Prime Minister used it against Canada itself. But this is also mobilized in a way that suggests that we have no legitimacy criticizing Russia or accusing Russia of violating Indigenous rights, given our own history of colonial violence and our ongoing wielding of that violence. So I leave at the end and say, is this an issue that Canada just needs to leave alone? In essence, this is going to be a tough one because I think morally and in terms of our values, we want to have a say, yet our interests may determine that this could come back to bite us. In terms of international security, I'm not going to spend much time on this here. I think it's important to remember that our defense policy emphasizes dialogue and deterrence, that we have a strong stance on Russia's unacceptable policies in Ukraine and how these breached international law, and that we have a role in enhancing NATO deterrence. But this doesn't imply that conflict over Arctic territory or Arctic resources is more likely. And I could spend an hour just talking about that one. Why I bring that up here is, does the Arctic Council cooperation euphoria and a desire to reinvigorate Arctic exceptionalism push against this principled stand that we've taken on Ukraine and sanctions? Are we going to get caught up in a moment where Russia, by promoting peace and stability and cooperation, might perhaps encourage us to relax some of these other strong stances that we've taken? It's not going to argue, I don't think, in any honest way that the Arctic Council should adopt a military security mandate, but we're already seeing side discussions connected to talk about the Arctic Council priorities, about the need to create military-to-military cooperative mechanisms. I think it's very important for Canada and others to separate these conversations from discussions about the Arctic Council at all, and to be very careful that our narratives don't suspiciously read into everything Russia says that there's an underlying military great power play at hand, because then we'll be, I think, rightfully accused of being susceptible in the West of being the cause of linking the Arctic Council and geopolitics. And we need to be careful that we don't perpetuate our own forms of misinformation and disinformation unwittingly. And I just put a link up there so you can read where I was going to go with that. So to wrap things up here with my final reflections, we're in a context in which Russia is searching to legitimize its dominant position in the Arctic. We need very careful, calibrated, coordinated messaging when we're dealing with a frenemy, to borrow Elena Wilson-Rowe, who you're going to hear from in just a moment, her wonderful phrase. So I asked, should we expect a barrage of conflicting messages from Russia as a friend through the Arctic Council and as an adversary through other Russian news and social media challenges? How do we ensure that Canadian and North American audiences have a sober appreciation of Russia's strategic goals and recognizing that, yes, we are international competitors, but not in the Arctic Council itself? And how do we counter unfavorable Russian narratives without succumbing to the same sort of propaganda, anti-Russian, pro-Western formulas that I'm suggesting Russia sometimes succumbs to? And at the end, and I think this fits with the messages of both the previous speakers, we really need to focus on the next 2 years in terms of the Arctic Council on what the Arctic Council is, what roles it has served, what roles we wish for it to serve, and not fixate on what it is not. So my message is, don't break what ain't broken. And Russia at the chair is also in a situation, due to those constraints that Gosia talked about, where it's highly unlikely to break the Arctic Council. Instead, I expect it to be a responsible steward of that chair and to continue it being that premier high-level forum for discussions amongst Arctic rights holders. Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney Langenbard. Great. A lot of ideas, as always, brought, and at the end, talk about frenemies, Russia's frenemy, and great transition, of course, to Elena Wilson-Rowe. So just a reminder for attendees, if you have questions, I saw already somebody posted a question in the Q&A section. At any time during the presentation of any panelist, if you have a question, make sure to type it in the Q&A. They could be answered right away by panelists, or we will use them in the Q&A section after the presentation of all panelists. On this note, I'll turn to Elena Wilson-Rowe, Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, based in Oslo, talking about not just on Canada, but more how the chairmanship could impact the relationship Nordic countries.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Matthew, so very happy to be invited here to speak. And I see we've had great panelists and talks so far, and we have such interesting folks assembled in the participant list. I'm looking forward to some question and answer. So I would like to I guess I pick up where everyone else has left off. I think this is such a well-organized session. But I guess I'll just first say, the Arctic Council really is a site of global governance, and it's a site for diplomacy. And diplomacy in general it's not something that only happens when all the actors involved trust each other completely, or where there's certainty about the intentions and actions of others. In fact, most of diplomacy is based in something that's quite different, except amongst the very closest of allies. So really, diplomacy isn't like what happens in the Arctic Council, isn't something that happens only amongst very close friends on the international stage or in the absence of conflict. It's really, in most political settings around the world, is simply found alongside what can often be difficult security or conflicting interest-related situations. But diplomacy has going for it, though, is that sometimes it's the only way of addressing what might be international or at least supranational policy problem. And it's also very comparatively inexpensive to some of the other potential solutions to either letting a policy problem run rampant or through outright conflict. So I'm going to organize my thoughts into 3 general points. I'm going to try to move quickly because we have one more exciting paper and then hopefully some discussion. So first, let's turn to some just general reflections on the upcoming chairmanship. I think other speakers have covered this quite well. But so again, like what Russia proposes for its chairmanship are really quite familiar topics. We've heard of this from Gosha and then Troy and then Whitney, from societal well-being to climate change adaptation to education and youth. Those are very familiar topics for an Arctic Council chairmanship. And a lot of the issues, and I think one reason why we see this sort of sustained attention to certain themes in the Arctic Council is also because some of the issues the Arctic Council addresses simply are not addressed in other forums. There isn't a different global governance or diplomatic setting in which these issues can be discussed in a collective way. So continuation of core trends, I think, is not a bad thing. You'll see I make kind of an argument that there needs to be innovation. There should probably be growth just due to kind of the existence of new challenges, and also to keep this diplomatic setting growing in terms of demonstrated governance capacity. And I think one issue that I will be following with interest is that, as I think Troy covered this, that Russia has very large economic interests in its Arctic region. And say this might be in contrast to, say, the United States and Alaska, where the Alaskan economy is not a big part of the national economy. Whereas in Russia, what is considered the Arctic really is a big part of national GDP. And so this focus on sustainable development, which, as Whitney noted, also includes natural resource extraction, is probably will be part of what we see as what I see as a very kind of longstanding tension amongst, or difference amongst, Arctic states. And that's primarily that some states have a much more sustainable growth or growth-oriented perspective on their Arctic areas, whereas other states come with perhaps more of a conservation-oriented approach on the international stage. So for the US, for example, in Arctic as well as broadly ocean issues has historically been a stronger voice for a conservation-oriented approach, whereas Norway and Russia, for example, with their large economic interests in northern and Arctic resources, may advocate for a more evidence-based or precautionary, but still growth-oriented strategy. I also think we're going to see how, I think it'll be interesting to see over this chairmanship and the next, simply to see how cooperation around maritime navigation and marine conservation efforts continue to develop, given the changing nature of the Arctic Ocean due to climate change. I also think this is just an extra point, and perhaps something we can come back to in the Q&A, that one feature of Arctic governance has, over time, when we look at who has driven governance forward, there's often been these cooperations between the US and Russia and kind of spearheading binding agreements for Arctic governance, from search and rescue to science cooperation. And I think it will be very interesting to see, especially as the US Biden administration's Arctic policy becomes more and more articulated and enacted, to see how that dynamic will play out. It's not only what Russia's intentions or aspirations will be. I think it will also matter how that dynamic, that kind of dyad in Arctic politics, comes together. Turning now to some reflections on the Nordic perspectives, areas of cooperation. And I think also, the Nordic states are also varied in what their views on the Arctic, also along that conservation and sustainable development or growth-oriented perspective I mentioned, but also simply, that Norway, for example, is an Arctic coastal state, whereas the others are not, and so on. But in any case, what you see, because of the proximity that the Nordic Arctic, and especially the Norwegian Arctic, has to Russia, what you see is that in addition to cooperation in the Arctic Council, you see close cooperation in areas of overlapping geography or interest with Russia. So fisheries management is one example, pollution control also being a longstanding area of cooperation. I will watch with interest to see whether or not there is enhanced cooperation on climate change adaptation, especially because that is part of the Russia Arctic Council Chairmanship platform, perhaps in the Barents neighborhood. And I think it's important to keep in mind that even though occasionally top-level officials or Putin may come across as a climate skeptic, or rather have even an opportunity framing relating to the new opportunities that climate change in the Arctic might bring, that on the regional level, in the Arctic regions themselves within Russia, and on the expert level, and also within the relevant ministries, climate change is widely seen as a threat to infrastructure, a risk, a cost, something that will have costs to Russia as climate change impacts fully manifest themselves. And of course, we also know that given the high, or I would say central role of oil and gas in Russia's economy, it's also important to see that decarbonization is also a threat to Russia's economy and international standing. So while in a broader sense, in the entire Russian state, what this is going to require is finding a role within the new green economy through human capital and innovative capacity. In an Arctic context, I do wonder if we'll see a shift also possibly within the Arctic Council to more attention to the broader issues and opportunities of the blue economy, which we hear about a lot in a broader global ocean context, from aquaculture to bioprospecting, or even to a topic I think that needs to be approached with great caution, but is of widespread interest, subsea mining. And the Arctic, for Russia being worth something, having an economic value, I think has contributed to some of perhaps the more innovative or cooperative approach that Russia has to the Arctic, that for the Russian domestic populace, the Arctic is often referred to as the treasure chest, kind of the savings bank of the Russian state for future generations. So I think we might see that this is partly why there's an emphasis on sustainable development. And I think partner countries working to contribute to the green shift might start to cooperate with Russia more closely on issues of the blue economy. So finally, just for a few observations and takeaway before I wrap up. Indeed, as Gosha, our first speaker, was saying, there is a volatile international environment that we didn't have to the same degree in the first decade of the Arctic Council. But what we see on the whole, I think, if we look empirically, is that, and this doesn't need to be based in long-standing senses of being allies or in a trust-based relationship, but rather, as Whitney was noting, that kind of the dynamic of frenemies that can have difficulty, very distinct problems in worldview and specific conflict in certain areas, and also find room to cooperate in others. And I also think that the changing physical nature of the region, while many kind of at the Arctic sea ice low kind of shock year of 2007, many predicted that this was going to be kind of trigger a new race for resources or geopolitical conflict in the Arctic, but rather what we saw came after was kind of like pearls on a necklace, these Arctic binding agreements that actually really demonstrated the willingness of Arctic states to work together on shared challenges. And I think that also has to do with a desire to demonstrate governance capacity, and that it is not necessary, or had not been necessary at the time, for an expanded role for non-Arctic states. So I kind of building on the whole, or Whitney had an interesting version of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. one could also say, though, that I would hazard, this is just my speculation, that I don't think the maintenance of the status quo is important diplomatically, but perhaps especially given the intensification of rivalry dynamics on the broader global stage, that it might also be necessary to seek to expand and innovate also within the Arctic Council setting to make sure that that format, while covering core kind of standard traditional issues, also expands to meet some new challenges. And these could relate to new economic sectors, managing the oceans of data that are expected about the ocean as we develop new technologies and data gathering techniques, could relate to technological change and so on. Well, we shouldn't just have a display of governance for the display's sake. The maintenance of the status quo alone may not be enough to temper with the intensified geopolitical winds. But at the same time, it is worth keeping in mind that although we are in a very tricky chapter in global politics, that the post-Cold War growth of Arctic cooperative governance indeed happened alongside an enduring NATO-Russia security rivalry that may not have been quite as acute as it is at the moment. So there is this kind of history of cooperation in conflict, and it's been achievable perhaps in the Arctic rather than elsewhere due to the border-crossing interconnectedness of the region's indigenous peoples, which hopefully we'll hear more about next, thriving circumpolar science policy networks. I would love to see a development of a circumpolar security politics network, even though that hasn't traditionally been the focus of the Arctic Council, and also simply the interlinked Arctic ecosystem itself. So this is not to argue that the Arctic is exceptional, but at the same time, like all places in the world, it is a specific place, and there are some specific forms of political and social capital that can be used to meet emerging governance challenges. So I guess just to wrap up, I think there are real geostrategic challenges facing the region, and that do figure in also to cooperation in the Arctic Council, but that the strategic lens alone is not enough to understand what is going on. And there is a risk, I do believe, that if the consuming politics of geopolitical rivalry could drain effort from or reduce the space that makes kind of this cooperation or diplomacy between frenemies possible. So that's something to be aware of. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to checking out your questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Ilana. Great presentation. Again, many ideas also that we'll probably come back to in the Q&A section for sure, about sustainable development, about that balance between environment and the economy as well, between Russia and the Nordic states, for example. On this note, we'll turn to our final presentation from Jen Sidorova. She's a postdoctoral scholar focusing on energy and environmental policies at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. And in this last presentation, what we explored, it was touched briefly about in Ilana's presentation as well as in Whitney's presentation, but a bit what is in store for Indigenous people in the next 2 years at the Arctic Council during the chairmanship, since they play a pivotal role as permanent participant. It's important to explore a bit what are some of the challenges they'll be confronted to, what are some of the opportunities they'll be confronted to. So on this note, Jen Sidorova.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you, organizers, for having me today. So I'm going to present about the indigenous peoples in the Arctic, how Russia sees it in the way that it's going to be like the next chair of the Arctic Council. So I should mention at the beginning that actually my analysis of the Russian position towards indigenous communities and their development is based on the analysis of the public statements made by these two public officials. So first of them is Alexander Krutikov. So he's a deputy minister for the development of the Russian Far East and the Arctic. So he's the person who knows a lot about the specifically Siberian, the Far East, which are quite remote from Moscow. So that's why he was probably appointed as the representative of these particular regions. And Nikolai Kurchinov, he's the Russian ambassador in the Arctic Council. So he's a diplomat. So he represents mostly like the position of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. So what I did, I just basically analyzed the main Russian newspapers, including the Kommersant or like some of the Russian websites, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, in order to find out what's actually the Russian official position when we talk about the indigenous communities in the Arctic and the way how Russia sees the socioeconomic development of indigenous communities in the Russian Arctic and in Arctic in general. So the general direction that Russia actually supports is the socioeconomic development of indigenous communities internally within Russia and also externally in the Arctic Council. So when I'm talking about the socioeconomic development of indigenous communities, what Russia was talking about, what the Russian officials were talking about, is basically not only the external development, not only like the international cooperation regarding indigenous communities in the Arctic, but mostly they talked about the necessity to support indigenous communities in the Russian Arctic, because they recognized the low level of the economic development of indigenous communities, specifically in Russia. They also recognize that the Russian Arctic consists predominantly of indigenous communities because they are like the main residents who live in the Arctic regions. So that's why like they pointed out like three main components of the socioeconomic development. The first of them is healthcare development. So what was suggested as a policy option for healthcare development is telemedicine. So basically telemedicine means that there are some public consultations that could be made using like online technologies. So basically someone who's employed in Moscow can consult indigenous communities up in the Arctic. So that's why like the telemedicine as an option for the development of healthcare of the indigenous communities is connected to the necessity to improve the infrastructure in the Arctic, predominantly internet connection. So that's like one of the first main components of the socioeconomic development. The second is the cultural heritage preservation. So Nikolai Korchinov said that it's important to host a summit of the Arctic peoples in Russia, where Russia, and I'm quoting that, could present present its cultural heritage and share its experiences of preserving cultural heritage, specifically of the small numbered indigenous communities. And that's why it was officially announced that Russia is going to host the summit of the Arctic peoples in the Russian territory, just to share its experience and share also the information about the local languages, local cultures of indigenous communities who live predominantly in the Arctic region. And the third is educational development. So the Russian officials pointed out that it's important to organize collaborative projects with other Arctic states. And I will talk about the educational development on my next slide a little bit more in depth. So direction first education, what is essential for the Russians is to support those languages, those indigenous languages that have the endangered status. So those languages that not a lot of people speak. So Russia also has like a rich history, like since the establishment of the Soviet Union, to translate some of the educational curriculum, some of the course outlines into the indigenous languages. So that's something that Russia is also going to continue doing. So that's why like the Russian government announced that they want to present this project called The Children of the Arctic. So they want to translate 15 textbooks into indigenous languages. And also the support of nomadic school. So nomadic school means that if the parents go to taiga, do some hunting or fishing, it's going to take some time, right? So for the parents, so that's why like it was recognized by the Russian government that the governmental support of nomadic schools, that's something that should be done as a governmental initiative within Russia. So the second direction that the Russian officials pointed out as a part of the Russian Arctic Chairmanship program is the development of logistics and infrastructure. So it was recognized that goods and services in the Arctic regions are extremely expensive, and indigenous communities suffer from the lack of the more affordable goods and services. So like, for instance, if you want to buy apples or like oranges, if you live up in the north, it's going to be very expensive for you. So that's why the Russian government announced that they want to improve the logistics. So by making it more transparent, by making the logistics more transparent, they could actually support the development of the infrastructure, and they will actually pay for logistical expenses in order to make this this system of the logistic more transparent. So they just want to kind of transform it into a more transparency by shipping the goods directly from producers, so those who produce these goods and services. So that's like a very important initiative when it comes to the support of indigenous communities in the Arctic, just to make some goods and services more affordable for them. The third direction that's going to be completely like mostly also like the internal initiative, but the Russians also want to learn something from the Arctic Council and the other Arctic states as well, is the establishment of the Economic Council. So that this Economic Council could provide control of adoption, organization, management, and implementation of some economic projects from the indigenous perspective. So that's a way for the Russian government to include indigenous peoples from the Russian Arctic into the control and monitoring of the economic initiatives up in the Arctic. So it could include like any like projects related to the industrial development, resource extraction, related to the educational projects, as well as the some of the projects related to the Arctic shipping as well. So they just want to involve indigenous communities into the economic development. So what? So as you probably already noticed that Russia is looking at the Arctic Council chairmanship as an opportunity to invest more domestically and also to learn more from other Arctic states, especially when it comes to the initiatives such as logistics. So, and as well as like educational opportunities. So Russia sees the upcoming Arctic Council chairmanship as the way to kind of like bring more attention to the necessity to meet the interests and needs of indigenous communities up in the Arctic. So Russia recognized that indigenous communities in the Arctic, they need more attention. So that's why like the Russian government wants to invest more money into their socioeconomic development. And the specific areas that Russia is looking at are the healthcare, the development of the infrastructure, the educational opportunities, like for instance, like professional development in order to create more more employment for indigenous communities, and the support of traditional subsistence. So just a month ago in April 2021, Prime Minister of Russia, Mikhail Mishustin, signed and approved the program that supported the traditional subsistence activities of indigenous communities. So this particular program looked at traditional subsistence activities such as fishing, hunting, horse breeding, reindeer herding as something that indigenous communities use as their traditional economies. So the main purpose of this initiative to make these traditional subsistence activities more competitive in the domestic market. So by supporting indigenous communities as entrepreneurs, by providing them some funding for small businesses, Mikhail Mishustin and the Russian government want to make these particular subsistence activities more kind of like competitive and something that could be considered as a successful business. So that's like the main purpose. And the way how Russia sees itself, sees these initiatives within the framework of the Arctic Council, it's more like Russia wants to share its experience of interaction with indigenous peoples in the Arctic, wants to share like some other like policy initiatives that could be implemented towards the socioeconomic development of indigenous communities. And also some of the policies that Russia actually identified as problematic, such as logistics, like were considered as something that could be a good learning experience from other states. So like Scandinavian states were considered to be like the something like the good collaborators in the future when it comes specifically to the logistical expenses. So Russia wants to learn from the Arctic states when it comes to indigenous communities. So limitations that I identified as a part of my analysis is the first of all, when it comes to the domestic projects, I think that corruption is going to be the main obstacle, because Russia is going to spend a lot of money on indigenous communities, because indigenous communities, traditional subsistence activities, sustainable development, and the infrastructure are considered to be as very important in the upcoming agenda of the Russian Arctic Council chairmanships. But corruption is definitely something that Russia is suffering at this moment. That's why like That's going to be a main limitation of the industrial projects in the Russian Arctic. The second limitation that I identified, that Russia has a lack of the settler colonial discourse, which is specific for North American countries, specifically Canada and the US, Alaska. That's why, like, during the collaboration, I think that some of the topics such as land claims, colonization, settler colonial discourse, truth and reconciliation should be avoided in the conversation, just simply because Russia has a very different history of interacting with indigenous communities. To be honest, Russia hasn't yet recognized the fact of the colonization of indigenous communities. And the concept of indigeneity is quite different in Russia, because like some of the larger indigenous communities whose population is more than 75,000 people, they're not considered to be indigenous. Like, for instance, the Sakha Yakutians are not considered to be indigenous legally. And the third could be like the more like securitized geopolitical environments, because definitely there are some post-Crimean consequences that definitely made the interactions with some states such as Canada more complicated. And that's why, like, also Russia didn't want to see the European Union as the main actor in the Arctic Council as well. So that's why, like, the more securitized geopolitical environment that is more difficult nowadays because of the involvement of China as a new Arctic player is going to play some of the new limitations for the collaboration specifically on the indigenous issues. So the topics of colonialism, the topics of security and securitizations, I think that they could create some obstacles for the development of indigenous initiatives in the Arctic Council during the upcoming Russian Arctic Council chairmanship. But that's pretty much it, and thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Jen. And again, I think many questions are always raised about these inclusion of actors, and probably come back on a few of those issues. On this one, vote, I would invite all panelists to open their camera to have kind of a discussion, also addressing a few questions. I saw a few in the chat that were raised by attendees. I know Whitney just said you have a question also. Let's start with one that was present in the chat, because it's been a while that's been there. Question was from Andrei Todorov. Despite the fact that Arctic security issues are excluded from the Arctic Council agenda, do you think that the Arctic states could start discussing the security issues and try to restore dialogue on the margins of the Arctic Council, maybe informally, maybe Troy and Whitney? I know you worked a lot on these questions.
Put a couple of links up here too after kind of done commenting. I'm hoping at this point now that we understand that there will be no Arctic hard security discussion in the Arctic Council. It's just not possible. It's not part of their mandate. It's not up for discussion. It's not up for debate. There is interest from Department of Defense, Canada, D&D, ministries of defense to do this in the proper form. Right? Russia has been making calls to do this at the expert level, get together and let's have a dialogue. I'll provide links about all the details in there. I can't disclose some particulars right now, but you're going to learn some stuff here pretty soon about what's going on this very topic. And I think you'll be pleased to find out some of the developments. You know, we know what the Arctic Council does and doesn't do. We know that their Arctic Coast Guard Forum has been absolutely instrumental in helping to understand some of the operating environment, just a model for perfect cooperation in a much different problem set, a lot of civil support. But the Arctic nations militaries, I think they're all very much ready to have a discussion on some of these issues that are kind of looming, how to interact in the Arctic, what are the rules, and pretty soon you're going to hear some updates here I think are going to provide a lot of encouragement. So, and then we'll have a discussion after that. Hopefully, Lugosia and I pretty much, we should be able to expand on that a little bit, hopefully, in an upcoming event. So I'll leave it at that.
Whitney, do you want to add something? Or?
No, just to say, it's a great question, Andre, and I appreciate it. And my suggestion is, I think this flows from what Troy is saying, I think it is valuable for Russia and valuable for all of the other Arctic Council members to not confuse things and in any way even send the signal that informally the Arctic Council is being used as a vehicle for dealing with these military to military. That's high politics. I think the Arctic Council has thrived because it has avoided some of those high political entanglements that in my mind can only disrupt. And we did see them disrupt in Finland. We saw it a couple of years ago. And in my view, it had no place there. It's best to not cross the streams unless you're facing that giant Stay Puft Marshmallow Man at the end of Ghostbusters, right? I mean, it's just best to keep them separated. But along those lines, I don't know, Mitch, if I can use this and usurp the chair from you for a second, just ask a question for Elena and Goja, because speaking about other mechanisms, you both mentioned the Arctic Economic Council. And I know you've both written on this and reflected on it. Do you see an opportunity in the next couple of years or an appetite on the Russian side to really invest resources, intellectual resources, energy, political capital into really reinvigorating that particular mechanism? Or is that something that was a Canadian sort of led dream that sadly is kind of moribund?
Alana, you want to go ahead?
Sure, Gosha. And I thought maybe I'd also pop in on Scott's Burbridge's question on China and the observers, just to pick up on that. I think it will be interesting to see how the relationship with the Arctic Economic Council develops, because if you look at their internal debates within the Arctic Economic Council, as Matthew and we've all looked at kind of in a recent book, you'd see that the aspirations of those businesses participating in the Arctic Economic Council is for a much more mature and interactive relationship with the political side, the Arctic Council itself. Yet I don't think we've seen a similar development on the political side within the Arctic Council. So I think it's going to be an area to watch, and obviously given Russia's interest in sustainable development issues, that maybe that we will see a little more activity during this next chairmanship. But I also think that there remain at the heart of the council so many kind of core issues about what kind of business we're talking about, what actors should be there. Is it for local community development, or is this kind of a place for national majors? And how do you traverse the distance between those different sorts of businesses is going to be interesting. And just to say, just one comment on the question on China and the observers, I think the comment that was made from Russia about the observers' expanded role, I'm interested to see how it develops, because I think that partly this, that Russia, actually kind of in cooperation with Canada, has typically had a bit more of a cautious approach to the role that observers will play. They were sort of instrumental in developing some I think actually quite useful illustrations and guidelines back in 2013 for the Karuna Ministerial, I believe. But at the same time, since then, kind of some of the activity and nature of the idea that these states really have don't have that much to offer is kind of shelved, that they need to be used and they need to have a voice and a place. So you've seen subsequent chairmanships since then kind of working on including observer voices, either through an own day or a chance to present their views. So I think it'll be interesting to see how Russia picks up on and works with that. But at the same time, I absolutely agree with this, I think a definite area to watch is this notion of, will Russia-China convergence change maybe not tomorrow or not during this chairmanship, but in the longer term, kind of the room Russia has to maneuver on its own security and foreign policies in the Arctic, particularly given, I think, Troy's presentation, or might have been Whitney, really highlighted the emphasis on investment and growth. And there's and the sorts of constraints that can sometimes accompany that, at least as we've seen in other parts of the world. So thank you.
Gus, you want to add a few things on the Arctic Economic Council or the observers? It was also in the Q&A question on the observer role.
Yeah, I think when it comes to Arctic Economic Council, I completely agree with Elana that it will be really interesting to see how this relationship will develop. And I think, well, a few observations that I could offer from my side. I think there is, of course, one question related to, well, how much, no matter how much support Russia as a chair of the Arctic Council will provide to this collaboration. There is, of course, this question that I kind of, well, hinted at in my presentation, that when it comes to really business cooperation in the Arctic at the very formal level, when it comes to actual projects and the question of funding, of course, it really comes to the matter of sanctions. And this is something, this is no go at this point, especially, of course, knowing new round of sanctions from United States. So this is actually one important issue to consider. And that was also in case of well, some of the ideas that Russia had for its chairmanship in the Arctic Council, the question that perhaps additional fund could be developed, that was mentioned, I think, in Troy, or maybe your witness presentation. But at the same time, other Arctic states, once again, made very clear, wait, perhaps we can stop at this point at the feasibility study for such fund, because there is no way to go with establishing fund for anything joined between Western states and Russia when it comes to funding. So that's one thing. I think it is also interesting to look at this from the perspective of Arctic Economic Council, which of course, it has been conceived from Canadian initiative during Canadian chairmanship. And then it was actually very interesting to see how the US response as the next chair after Canada was very different. So in a sense, of course, Arctic Economic Council for the last few years, it has been going, well, just through establishment phase to kind of, well, setting up things, gaining its capacity, administration, et cetera, et cetera. But there is this thing that, of course, that we can very well see that different Arctic nations have very different attitude toward Arctic Economic Council. And I think, if I might say, because Elana rightly mentioned here that Arctic Economic Council, it seems, has been particularly focused now on political relationship, establishing political connections with the Arctic Council. And I would argue that perhaps that another way for the Arctic Economic Council to proceed would be also to seek more regular collaboration and linkages with the working groups and with permanent participants in the Arctic Council. Even though Arctic Economic Council resembles, it pretty much mirrors the structure of the Arctic Council when it comes to its composition. So far, it did not really have a very good record of establishing, building trustful relationship with permanent participants in the Council and with the working groups. And I'm saying this for a reason that we definitely see that more and more working groups of the Arctic Council, they are looking at economic aspects of different developments. I mean, just now, yesterday, the report that was launched with OECD about economic health effects of reducing air pollution. This work is ongoing. There are definitely areas where Arctic Economic Council could collaborate more closely with working groups. And on the other hand, what it would give to this is actually continued relationship. So something that won't be a rating from one chairmanship to another. And on the top of that, of course, senior Arctic officials also rotate on a very regular and quite frequent basis. So that would be another aspect. When it comes to the question of observers, I do, of course, now we are looking at whether new observers will be admitted to the Arctic Council in May. So we'll see whether we'll have another expansion of this group. I think what is also interesting when it comes to observers is that, of course, so much of this discussion is driven by looking at non-Arctic states as observers to the Arctic Council. Yay, nay, however they position themselves in this. But I think that when it comes to some of the challenges or how they could be addressed more effectively as we'll be moving into future in the Arctic, for me, interesting example is now that we have organizations such as IMO as observer to the Arctic Council. So in a sense, locating IMO in the same line of observers, really to kind of, and the fact that relationship with observers is in some way structured through the lens of non-Arctic states, I think sometimes might be a bit detrimental to how more effective and different, more flexible forms of collaboration with observers could be developed. Again, given that now we really have bodies that regulate matters such as Arctic shipping, in the Arctic. So I think it is really interesting how this overall question of observers will develop.
And maybe just one more note, if any panelists want to jump in on anything, unmute, and that will be my sign that you want to jump in the question. I think Whitney had a question for Jen before we go back to the Q&A.
Actually, it kind of dovetails with the question that John Crump posed. So Mathieu, I don't know if you want to pose that one first, and then maybe I have a little bit of a follow-up, or just I'd love to just chat with Jen a bit about this.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we can address the question that was in the Q&A, John Crump. So how do you see the role of other permanent participants in the context of what Russia is planning vis-a-vis indigenous people in that country? Most activities are domestically oriented and don't touch on indigenous rights, or at least the language being used avoids referring to indigenous people's rights. And I might add, given what you said about one limitation being not talking about colonialism, not talking about land titles or land rights, it seems to collide with some of the discourses we're hearing in Canada when we talk about indigenous issues. So if you can maybe expand on your take, Jen, on this question.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because this is actually something that I paid attention to, because Russia has a very different settler colonial discourse that probably doesn't really exist. And I think it's more likely it's because it's historically constructed. So the social construct of indigeneity and settler colonial context is completely different in Russia. So that's why, like, I would say, when I was reading through the Russian Arctic strategy, when I was like reading through the public statements, it's mostly like the idea that the indigenous communities in the Arctic represent the residents of the Arctic zone who need infrastructure, who need more improvements of the socioeconomic development. And in some way, it was the idea that because indigenous communities have lived there for many generations, they know more about nature. So this is more like similar to the Soviet approach, because in the Soviet Union, the idea of adopting the concept of the small numbered indigenous communities was mostly related not to the idea of the colonialism and truth and reconciliation, but mostly to the idea of protecting. So small numbered indigenous communities were presented in the Soviet Union as those communities who need special governmental protection and support. So that's the idea of adopting this specific legislation on indigenous rights. But definitely Russia lacks the discussion on the settler colonial discourse. The colonialism has not been discussed much in the literature and just in a public discussion. So that's the reason why indigenous rights or like land claims, agreements, like anything like that do not exist in the Russian legislation. And the reason why traditional subsistence activities are being supported by the Russian government, because that's a way kind of like to taking care of indigenous communities as citizens of Russia. So that's something that giving them opportunity to preserve their cultures. And in some way, it's good that traditional subsistence activities are being recognized by the Russian government. So they are like treated as legal parties, like small entrepreneurs who just simply have different ways of living, like sustaining, like supporting their economies. So I would say that, unfortunately, I think that when it comes to indigenous, trans-indigenous cooperation, since none of the permanent residents, with the exception of Raypon, was mentioned, in the material that I've been reading, it's mostly like there is also the idea of the foreign agents, probably like Russia is very aware like that there is a possibility for it. Like there are like many, like for instance, some Russian newspapers were just simply banned because they were considered to be working for the foreign agencies. So that could be like the obstacle as well, that limitation in trans-indigenous cooperation. So this is also the issue that I think that should be mentioned. Yeah.
Evgenia, it's interesting if I can jump in, because that was the question I was going to ask you. You know, we've seen the fate of the CIPS, which I mentioned briefly, forcibly dissolved in 2019. We've seen Yazavy Manzurn shut down in 2015 after being labeled foreign agents. We've seen the fate of Dmitry Berezhkov, the Aboriginal Forum Network, being shut down as well by promoting these rights. Again, do you see then that there's actually a strong possibility of there being collaboration between Indigenous organizations apart from only RIPON. So apart from the Kremlin-sanctioned Russian Indigenous representatives. Do you see any possibility to go back to the INDRIT program, for example, the Indigenous exchange programs that used to exist within Inuit Circumpolar Council, supported by Global Affairs Canada, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in the 90s, 2000s? Or do you think that because of this, as you brought up, the foreign agent apparatus, that this means that it's very unlikely that we really will get meaningful, substantive exchanges going on beyond sort of the state appointed, state sanctioned representatives? And I know that's a really delicate issue, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, Evgenia, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Can I tack on a question to Jen as well, related on a kind of on a different vector? I was also wondering if you could speak to, having covered some of the, that there are some big plans for Arctic development budget plans and so on, and Troy covered some of them and you covered some of them. But recently, I think the budget has shown that these are going to be seriously underfinanced below original goals. And I wondered if you had been following that as it plays out for community development projects in the Russian North. So quite different question, but I thought I'd tack it on.
Thank you for the questions. So answering Whitney's question, so it's more like, I remember about like how Mary Simon and Sheila Wack-Cloutier were talking about the success of the Inuit Express as the program in the 1990s. But I think that I actually read and I tried to identify the way how it actually has become possible, like how it became possible for the Russians to cooperate with the Canadians. And I think it's mostly because the president administration was different, the politics was quite different. And I think that some of the Canadian embassy played a very important role in this collaboration as well. So the political environment in Russia was completely different, but at this particular time, I think that the Russians are also aware that some Russian-Canadian Indigenous cooperation happened in the 1990s, and if they wanted the ICC to participate in the upcoming Russian chairmanship and the development of the socioeconomic development of Indigenous communities, they would have mentioned that for sure, but they didn't. So that's why I think that they just tried to avoid any involvement of the foreign agents, since like given the status of the permanent participants that Indigenous organizations in the Arctic Council are not only like, I would say, they do not only represent Indigenous communities, but the formal status of Indigenous organizations in the Arctic Council is probably like more similar to transnational corporations. So that's why like they just want to avoid any topics related to colonialism, land claims issues, truth and reconciliation. That's why they don't want to risk. And that's why I think that's the main purpose, why permanent participants were not mentioned in the conversation about Indigenous rights. And answering Elana's question, I think that Russia did put quite a lot of money into the development of the Indigenous communities up in the Arctic. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the exact sum of money, but it was quite a large sum, quite a large amount of money. So that's why I think that one aspect that I didn't pay attention in my presentation was actually that the Russian government paid the specific emphasis on the involvement of the subnational region in Indigenous cooperation, in Indigenous development. So we have a lot of ethno-national regions in Russia, like for instance, Republic of Sakha-Yakutia, where I'm from. It's mostly like, I would say, politically, it's Indigenous dominated. So that's why like, I think the Russian government wants to cooperate a lot with specific like ethnic regions like Tuva, Republic of Sakha, Chukotka, like those regions that have large majority of the Indigenous population actually being in politics. So that's why like that's something that also makes the allocation of money, funding, and the political agenda are quite different from probably activities of the other Arctic states. Because I know in Canada has Nunavut. And I think that my home region is probably like quite similar to Nunavut as well. So it's like, imagine the situation of if Nunavut was actively involved into the Canadian Arctic Chairmanship. So that would be like the comparison. Thank you.
While we're on this note of subnational actors, subnational governments, maybe a question for Troy. You studied extensively the early announcements of what the chairmanship will look like. how do you see the role that subnational governments, like I think Jen, you mentioned the Republic of Sakha and other governments in the Arctic zone could play? Is it a central role in your mind anyway, based on early announcements? Is it a secondary kind of role as a tool or a pawn, or how do you see it?
Oh, good question. What I've noticed, and I think, you know, what Whitney and I have studied, and so many others that help me to understand this, is Russia, in the way it conducts strategic communication in general, is inherently completely different from the West. It's not reactionary. It's whole of government with a very powerful central purpose. In the case of the Russian Arctic Council chairmanship and Russian Arctic interests, this is no different. I can't find anybody who is at top levels of authority, down to academia, low-level actors, private sector, who don't say the exact same narrative talking points about just about any other topic you want to talk about. Northern Sea Route, the chairmanship, politics, defense. It seems like the entire nation of Russia has been extremely well briefed and prepared to speak in one voice about Russian Arctic interests. So primary, secondary, whatever roles, it's very complementary, especially in the public sector, throughout the public sector. And when it comes to this discussion on the indigenous, especially Russia, is you know, we saw for the first time, I think, in these development strategies and this implementation plan from last week, more inclusion of indigenous peoples articulated in these strategies than we've ever seen before. And it's caused, I think, a lot of curiosity as to what is that going to mean? To what extent is that actually genuine versus last minute, let's get all of the strategies looking like it's highly inclusive, or, you know, but Jen is definitely telling us a lot of how to understand the inner workings of this. So I really appreciate that.
And I encourage if attendees have questions to write them in the Q&A. I have maybe one more question on my list, because a few have been addressed already with the Arctic Economic Council and the Observer issue. A question for Alana, because you referred to the balance between environment and the economy. I think many refer to Russia maybe focusing a bit more on the economy and focusing more on economic development, now not ignoring completely environmental protection, environmental issues. You raised that interesting question that for many Nordic countries, decarbonization and extremely bold and robust CO2 emissions plans could be conceived by Russia, or could be in complete opposition to what Russia has in mind in terms of developing gas and oil. Not saying that Nordic countries are not doing that. I mean, Norway's doing quite a bit of that, but do you see it as, do you see room to cooperate on this note, noting that probably sustainable development means for the Russian government maybe more focusing on the economy more than the environment, and for Nordic countries probably means focusing more on the environment than the economy, not ignoring the other variable. But do you see room to cooperate there, or see more an irritant, something that could represent an obstacle?
Well, it's like good in the kind of the conservation sustainable development. I think if we look at the Arctic Council, that is one of the vectors of kind of, maybe not a pendulum swing, but of tension or different positions, and also having to do with what you often hear from a lot of the Arctic states themselves, always talking about they do want to cooperate in the circumpolar Arctic, but then they always want to remind that there are many Arctics and there are different conditions all over the Arctic, and these allow for different sorts of activities. And I think that's something is, it's also empirically a fact, but it's also an important part of creating space for these national preferences when it comes to how economic development will take place. And I think one of the areas that's likely, that Russia does have strong traditions of kind of natural parks, nature reservoir, setting aside large tracts of land or sea. So I think that might be a direction things will continue to develop, almost a zoning of Arctic space or a zoning of natural space that has to do with some areas are clearly kind of set aside for economic purpose and others might be set aside for natural conservation. And that serves some ends, but not all ends when it comes to the problems of precautionary approach to development and sustainable development and so on. I think, you know, in the long run, I think we hear this perhaps with Europe as being a major customer of Russian petroleum products and having such an assertive and a plan for decarbonization of the European economy. I think this is something maybe we hear about more on this side of the ocean, is also just about how, you know, the green economy is going to create a new geo-economic picture, and there will be kind of new factors of winning and new factors of losing. So I think that in how Russia weathers this transition to what is going to be a changed global economy in 30 to 50 years is an extremely important thing to be considering also in the context of European security and stability. So I think that I do think we will see the Nordic countries perhaps reaching out more on the prospects of the blue economy and ocean growth, which I think in some ways are a bit worrisome in how overblown, how many hopes are now pinned to the oceans, which are also under pressure from global climate change and related overfishing and other issues. Yet at the same time, I think that will be, and working to keep the Arctic a zone that provides not only a zone that is economically productive, I think is seen as being an important source of stability in the region as well. So I do think we might see the Nordic countries cooperating more with Russia in these kind of transferring the discourse from global ocean governance and global ocean sustainable development debates and discourses into the Arctic, and possibly as a source of cooperation to continue, particularly to also to coordinate policies, but also to maybe sustain that opportunity framing relating to the Arctic as a source of regional stability.
I'm seeing in the chat, Whitney, you put a source released yesterday on the blue economy, which just referred to. Maybe a question for you, Whitney. There was one in the chat for Jen. I'm seeing, Jen, you're answering that question. You're typing. So maybe, Whitney, if you want to start, do Canada and Russia's, oh, sorry, Kasia, you want to add something? Oh, after? Okay. So I saw in the chat, oh, it just disappeared from mine. So I guess Jen answered. Maybe Whitney, if you want to add, do Canada and Russia's treatment of Indigenous people mirror each other in terms of using them to demonstrate sovereignty in their Arctic region? So maybe to use them as a tool of diplomacy or to assert sovereignty. Yes. Yeah, Whitney?
Yeah, I defer to the others who have much more expertise on how Russia actually mobilizes Indigenous representation in the southern position. My reading of it, though, would be, no, I think we use it quite differently. I mean, since, if I'm just pick an arbitrary date, 10 September 1985, Joe Clark's speech in the House of Commons, when we declared our intention to establish straight baselines to enclose our historic internal waters and mobilizing Inuit and other Indigenous peoples as, I would argue, the bedrock of Canada's sovereignty position, confirmed in the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement. It is predicated on tethering sovereignty now with Indigenous rights. It's laden in the discourse, nation-to-nation relationships, reconciliation. And I think for the reasons that Evgeny explained, Russia has a very different political discourse around these issues. And I think it speaks to a fundamentally different imagining of how Indigenous peoples have legal position within our respective federations. So I think the answer is no, I don't think this is an area where we're mirror images whatsoever. I think it's actually a point of a pretty substantive divergence. And as Evgenia brilliantly put, you know, it really is something that's difficult because we sometimes come from the West and establish a set of expectations that are born of a very different ontology. And I think that's something definitely worth exploring. And I think Jen was great to bring it up as a potential point of divergence.
We're almost running out of time, but Jen, do you want to add something? I know you answered this in the chat thinking it's not related. You want to add something to this?
No, actually, like I completely agree with Dr. Leckenbauer's position.
Gazia, you wanted to add something?
Thank you. It was just to reiterate, because I think Alana brought extremely important point that I think we'll be looking more and more into the future. And this is really the question, well, I would call it the geopolitics of climate change in a sense. So really the major shift that we might be looking into, and I think it was really interesting. It was just yesterday that High Representative of the EU, they published an op-ed where they were really pointing out to the consequences of green transition. So that's one thing. But I think here I would also like to add perhaps some call for, well, reflection and maybe action, because I think, of course, knowing the tensions between the countries, it's we I think oftentimes focus on what is actually feasible, what is possible, what is the pragmatic approach to maintain diplomatic relationships between the countries. But I think also reflecting how in this geopolitically tense environment, we can be thinking, well, how to advance race to the top to address climate change. I think this is a real challenge. So not only that we are trying to maintain the lowest common denominator, but what are ways perhaps that we can be pushing for more action, and where are those areas? I think that would be also worth to address in the future.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we're already out of time. It seems gone so quickly. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their time today and their insights. As we look into what the chairmanship will look like, I mean, it's only in 3 weeks' time that it will open. And maybe, who knows, if you're all available in 1 year to assess at a 1 year point to assess where the chairmanship is at, and some of the ideas and thoughts we had, if they materialized or not. I know for Troy and Whitney, some of your analysis on these questions are also available through the NAADSN website. If you quick impact assessment and issue policy papers are there as well. To conclude to some that ask in the Q&A, the video caption will be available, so stay tuned to the CIPS, so the Center of International Policy Studies Center. It's going to be available on that site. We're also going to publicize it through different through Twitter accounts and Twitter messages in the upcoming days. So on this note, I would like to thank you all who attended for attending this event. I'll thank all of our panelists for also participating, giving their time to share their insights with us. Thank you.